Bill Hammond, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Tell us a little bit about how you got started in politics.
Okay, well, my history in politics actually goes back to 1964 when I was a senior in high school and I was a volunteer for Barry Goldwater. And then went on, finished high school, went to college, and was somewhat inactive and then moved to Texas. And 1976, I became active again in politics. I was always interested in public policy. I volunteered in several campaigns and actually met my wife in politics. She was volunteering for Nancy Judy, who was running against Jim Maddox for Congress in 1976. And then in 1980, I was chairman of a campaign for a district judge in Dallas County. One of my good friends ran for district judge and was one of the early Republicans to be elected countywide in Dallas. And then in 1982, I ran for the legislature. And I challenged an incumbent Republican who'd been in the legislature for 10 years. And myself and two other individuals ran against him. And we barely got him into a runoff, and then we beat him in the runoff and served for 8 years in the Texas House.
So what gave you the sort of bug to finally run?
Well, I mean, I'd always been interested in public policy. I just think it's fascinating. I thoroughly enjoyed my time in the House. My main area of interest has always been public education. Improving the quality of public education for all Texans has been critically important to me. And it's currently that way in my present job where workforce is a major issue. And my wife and I had both been active. I asked my wife's permission, she granted it, and actually she's the one who got me elected because she was much better known at the time than I was, and her friends became active and worked very hard in the campaign and dragged me across the line.
So you were active in Republican politics at a time when that was still really sort of on the rise in the state.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, yeah, and 1980 was really the first time that Republicans were elected countywide in Dallas County.
So, you know, did that give you any pause? Was there ever any sense that you might run as a Democrat when you looked at, you know, I mean, I think now the case is kind of reversed, where I think there, you know, we both know people that we won't name that probably could have run either way and decide to run where the action is and where party identification gives them an edge.
Well, I mean, I've been a Republican pretty much all my life, and I was running in a state house district that was a Republican district. Essentially, the primary was tantamount, as I used to say, to election. In this particular case, because it was a new district, a Democrat did run, but it was pretty much a token race on his part.
So did you go directly from the House to TAB?
No. I served for 8 years in the Texas House. I had all the fun I could afford. I always say that if I'd chosen my parents more carefully, I might still be serving, but it's a very expensive hobby to serve in the Texas House. And so I didn't run for re-election. I wasn't defeated, I just gave it up. And then in 1995, then Governor Bush appointed me to be chairman of the Texas Workforce Commission. It was a newly formed agency. And I did that for 2.5 years. And then for the last 14 years, I've been at the Texas Association of Business.
So tell us what the Texas Association of Business does.
Sure. Well, our mission is to create the best business climate on the planet so that when businesses make a decision about where to expand or relocate, the answer will be Texas. We advocate on behalf of all the employers of the state before the legislature, agencies, and Congress on issues that cut across all employers. We're what I refer to as a horizontal organization, as opposed to, say, the Oil and Gas Association, which represents the interests of the oil and gas industry. So we look at issues like taxes, health insurance, insurance in general, the environment, energy, transportation, water, and of course, education.
You mentioned your earlier interest in education and, you know, workforce development. So tell us a little bit about how you conceive of education as an issue that's important to business.
Well, I mean, the statistics are pretty startling. In Texas today, of 25 to 35-year-olds, only about 30% of Texans have any kind of post-secondary degree or certificate. I mean, I'm not talking about UT necessarily. I'm talking about ITT or getting a certificate from Austin Community College. Any post-secondary certificate or degree at all, only 30% of Texans have one of those. That compares to an national average of about 42%. And that number needs to rise to 60% very quickly. About 2/3 of the jobs that will be created between now and 2020 will require some form of post-secondary education of one sort or another. So we're looking at an enormous skills gap. And our focus is on increasing the productivity pre-K through community colleges, through higher ed, to meet the needs of the employers. My biggest personal fear is that we will not have an educated workforce and the jobs will go elsewhere. I always think my wife and I are very blessed. We have 3 children, all of whom graduated from college. And they're all employed, thank goodness. But I worry about the kind of Texas they'll be in 20 years. And their children will be in 20 years in terms of the kind of economy. 18% of adults in Texas lack a high school diploma. And according to Dr. Murdoch, our demographer, or former demographer, unfortunately that number is growing. And it's a recipe for disaster. So our hope is to engage the business community as a leader, as a critical friend of education at all levels, and hold the systems more accountable for their performance.
Now, how did that position as a critical friend, let's start with K through 12,
okay,
kind of affect the agency's sort of policy recommendations and positions in the last session?
Well, I don't know that we were at battle with the agency so much during the last session. I mean, prior to that, I have felt like the public school accountability system came nowhere near reflecting reality. I mean, they created a system that they had at one point, they had 70% of the campuses in Texas is either exemplary or some other higher rating, I can't remember the exact name, but recognized, exemplary or recognized, at a time when only about 2/3 of the kids graduate from high school in 4 years, and half of the kids who show up at the community college doors have to take remedial courses. I mean, the two of them, there's a disconnect somewhere.
Recognized for what, one might ask.
Exactly. Yeah. So our point was that we wanted to have an honest system, because we believe if we tell Texas where we are today, Texans will react in a way as a critical friend, if you will, and hold the systems accountable. I think we're getting a false impression from the agency, or were, during that time. And so when I was a critic, and people would say, well, that's not true, the superintendent says we're doing great. And the superintendent says, well, we're rated exemplary. How is it we're not great? Well, they weren't great. And then 3 years ago, a brand new system came on, STAR, and the end of course exams, which we were very supportive of. And actually the education community supported it. I would say our battles more recently with the agency are over the implementation of the new accountability system. It's my belief that the commissioner did not prepare the education community at all for what was coming. There was a total lack of guidelines of any sort. I mean, essentially there was radio silence from the agency at a time when we were bringing on board an entirely new accountability system. There were many very legitimate unanswered questions about the new system and the administration of it. You put that on top of the fact that even though many superintendents supported it, they were very concerned because they knew what was coming. The end of course exams are much more rigorous than the old system. And they would reflect, in a sense, badly on the educational community because they would be telling the truth, whereas the old system did not tell the truth. I mean, they got credit, for, I call it an Enron-style system. They got credit for, fake earnings in a sense. We're strongly supportive of the new system. We think it'll be much better, but the agency has led to a lot of consternation, legitimate, on the part of the school districts. And there's been a tremendous backlash now. There's a massive effort on the part of school districts and superintendents to roll back the new accountability system, which is just now going into place now. So we're heavily engaged. We've written a lot of letters. We've done op-eds and even a full-page ad in the Statesman on the issue.
Right, which some people took as unkind in tone, perhaps.
Well, I'd be happy to talk about that if you like.
Well, I'm just curious what you, more specifically, what you think the interim solution is. I mean, is it that the agency needs to kind of get off the dime and prepare the districts? Do you think the districts have enough of a legitimate complaint that rolling back is a reasonable response? Or?
Well, specifically, the agency needs to get it on the job. And I mean, they've really known about this for 5 years. Legislation passed 5 years ago that set us on this path. And then 3 years ago, the final legislation was passed and signed into law. So the agency and the community, et cetera, have had full time to full warning. I mean, this is not something that came overnight, and they supported the change. Then you have the agency not doing its diligence in terms of explaining the administration, and they're legitimate, very legitimate questions. And the issue, the hottest issue was the issue of whether the exam should count for 15% of a student's grade. The commissioner made the decision, which we supported in the end, to waive the 15% requirement for this year based on the fact that they hadn't been given proper instruction. So we said, okay, we'll stop fighting about the 15% for this year because our goal is to maintain the system, or as much of it as we possibly can, in the coming years when we know there'll be a full onslaught trying to do away with it. I mean, I don't know, I hear different numbers, but 40, 50, 100 school districts have passed resolutions calling for wholesale changes in the system.
So you think that was a reasonable, so from your position, it was kind of a reasonable compromise to keep the system undergoing and work, continue to work out
the way it works at the end of course exams, which are far superior to the old way where we had one test for all of high school. I mean, there's no accountability in that. End of course exams, you take algebra, you take a course exam, and we know how the students did on that particular subject and how the teacher did, et cetera, et cetera. And we thought it's important that the exam count for a part of the grade because it engages the students more in the outcome. Also, one thing that happened was that many districts, because of the lack of instruction as to how to interpret 15%, I mean, to me, it's pretty straightforward. Is 15% of your final grade? Even I can figure out what that means. But districts were saying that we don't know how to administer it, we don't know what everybody can do. And some of them came up with these schemes where the 70 is passing. So they were going to say that anybody who got between 0 and a 69 gets a 69, and anybody who gets between 70 and 100 gets 100. Well, I can cite my own family. I mean, we have 2 boys and a girl, and the boys never experienced any academic anxiety. So if they had cruised into Algebra 1 exam with 73, they would have figured out that if they got a 0 on the test, they'd get a 69, and so they get a 72 in the course, negating the value or the importance of the test. They'd sign their name and say, I'm done. Conversely, our daughter, who would have studied hard and done well, although fearing failure at the same time, would have gone in, perhaps gotten a 95, and she gets the same credit as someone who got a 70. I mean, it was ridiculous. They do have the fact that they have to have a cumulative passing grade. That's maintained. But at the same time, we felt like it was important that they maintain the 15% rule. Now, I've said publicly, and it's our position, that we're willing to waive the 15% the first time the test is administered. The kids who are now 9th graders are the first kids to take the test, and they will be the first 10th graders, 11th, et cetera. And so we say, okay, waive the 15% for all of them in return for maintaining the new system, because we think it will reap benefits. If I could quickly add, the one other thing that people don't take into account is that initially the passing rate or the cut score on the exam will be embarrassingly low, because the politics of it are such that Robert Scott, the commissioner, is not going to fail 60% of the kids because they missed, you know, they got below 70 out of 100. I mean, it's going to be closer to 30 out of 100. It's going to be passing. And then they'll take the results and say that, you know, I don't know what the numbers will be, but, you know, 50 is an A and 45 is a B, et cetera, et cetera. So not everybody's going to fail, as some would have you believe. And then over time, as they've done in the past, they'll ratchet up the cut score and the kids will respond.
I think you have a good read of how students evaluate grades.
Okay.
I just want to say.
Okay.
Sticking with K through 12 for a minute, I want to kind of look at the other side of that. Going
Sure.
into the session, I was going back and looking at the op-ed piece you published, at least one version of in the Tribune. I suspect probably appeared some other places. Early in the session, talking about the priority that education funding should receive for things like the textbook funds, going into what was a very difficult and strained fiscal session last time. How do you think that all panned out?
Well, I mean, reasonably well. I mean, not great. You know, obviously the economy was, you know, in a ditch, so to speak. And we certainly were strong advocates of using the rainy day fund, which of course everybody said they would never do, and very quickly they did. I mean, in the one sense, to be very specific, they didn't use it because they lied about Medicaid. And they said, well, Medicaid is going to actually cost a lot less than everyone knew it was going to cost. So when they come back in January, they'll raid the rainy day fund to pay for the shortfall in Medicaid. So effectively, they used it. Right. We felt it was very important to try to maintain as much funding as possible for public education. You know, if you look at the funding overall over time, sort of higher ed definitely took some hits. I mean, you all know that. But K-12, really going back prior to this last session, for the last 10 years or so, they received increased funding beyond growth in population and inflation, et cetera, from the state. Even in '03, which was the last really bad budget cycle prior to this recent one, education got more money than the formulas indicated. So for the first time ever, they didn't account for growth. They didn't follow the formulas. So we're not saying that's not a good thing, but at the same time, it's kind of somewhat realistic.
Do you think they'll revisit the issue of the formulas next time?
Well, yeah. I mean, I don't think so much next time, because I think that it'll be kind of on hold. Everyone expects the school finance lawsuit to not reach the Supreme Court or have a decision from the court sometime until after the next regular session. Typically, the court will allow them at least until the next regular session. I mean, they may not. They might say, guys, get back to town, work it out. But I think that I don't expect a lot of changes in school finance next year prior to a decision by the Supreme Court regarding the current school finance lawsuit.
And there has been a history of legislation via lawsuit, right?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Move on to higher ed briefly.
Sure.
Then. So it seems to me you were engaged, and you made reference to higher ed in your initial comments. Sure. About why it was important to Texas Association business and business more broadly. You've been particularly, it seems, focused on the community colleges.
Right.
Talk a little bit about that and why
Sure.
you all have been focused on that.
Well, I mean, community colleges are the, they're the point of entry for so many Texans, so many first-time Texans. I mean, first in family to attend beyond high school. Obviously, especially in terms of Hispanics and African Americans, who is the real challenge that education faces in Texas today, is getting more minorities into and out of high school with a diploma that means something. I mean, 53% of Texas school children are Hispanic, and half of them don't graduate in 4 years. That's not good. That's very, very bad. And so the community colleges are so important to providing the skills necessary, and also being a starting point for people who are going to go on to UT or wherever, another four-year institution in their area perhaps. It's a focal or a starting point. And we believe that the community colleges do not pay enough attention to completions. And we worked last session with several different organizations on trying to get 10% of their money to be based on their completion rate. Now, currently in Texas, most of the funding for higher ed is based on students sitting in the classroom on the 12th day of class. What happens beyond that point matters not in terms of the funding. Now, I know that here at UT, they get a relatively small amount of money relative from the state, but a lot of other four-year institutions get a lot more money, for a number of different reasons. But the community colleges get substantial funding from the state, and they're one of the worst offenders in terms of completion. Austin Community College, of the students who show up and say they want to get an associate's degree and are full-time students, which is admittedly a small percentage of their overall student body, but in 3 years, only 4% of those get an associate's degree. I think that's extremely poor performance, and I think that a lot of it is based on the fact that the funding matters not. I mean, it doesn't impact their funding at all. And of the part-time students, who are the bulk of community college students across the state, only 24% of them ever get a degree or certificate from any institution in 6 years. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to tap them on the shoulder and get their attention and sort of turn the battleship in the ship channel to say, look, guys, all this access is great. And I think we've really done a good job in Texas on access over the last 10 years or so. Higher Ed Coordinating Board is focused on it. We've got a lot more kids going, but they're not walking across the stage. So we're spending a lot of money, they're spending a lot of money, they're getting a lot of debt, and there's not a lot of results to speak for. And I think that it's a lot about leadership with all institutions of higher education. Texas being, having probably the best rate of any public school in Texas. I mean, UT Austin. And even so, the president has made it his goal to increase the completion rate at UT, which is very laudable. And I think he can do it. And I think the other schools, if they begin to worry about completion rates, they can do a much better job. I don't know what happens here. My son went here and graduated. At the time, he was in, the advanced course. What is it? Plan 2, yeah. And, they treat them really good. Now, the average student here, I don't know about in terms of counseling and that sort of thing that takes place, but I know at a lot of the community colleges, it's almost non-existent. You sort of handed a course book, and that's it. And we need to have their focus more on the student, working with the student, counseling them about taking the right courses in the right sequence and offering the right courses in the right sequence so kids can walk across the stage and get a degree. We need the educated, skilled workforce. And more money is not going to happen. I mean, not in the near future. So we've got to increase the productivity of all, K-12 and higher ed.
Now, we should note that by tap on the shoulder, that included billboards in communities.
There you go. Well, I'll tell you, here's the deal.
That's a pretty strong tap, right?
Well, okay. But we tried to work with them during the session, and we got no response, basically, because they knew they had us. They had us beat. And so to me, it was very disappointing, and we couldn't pass our legislation. So I was trying to get coverage for it. And we got a little bit. We didn't get near the kind of coverage that I thought we would get, that it would create. And it was a little bit of a stunt, I'll admit that. We rented a billboard in Austin for one day at a cost of $400. And Richard Rhodes did see the billboard, I believe, where it was pointed out to him, the president of ACC. And they got mad. That's fine. I don't really care. But actually, the net of all this was I sat down with 6 community college presidents probably a month or so ago. And I said, basically, if you guys can agree to a formula with Paredes, who's the ED of higher ed in Texas, on a formula that allocates 10% of your money based on completion rates, I'm happy. I'm going to leave you guys alone. And they said they would work on it. Now, I don't know what will happen, but I can tell you that our efforts, along with a lot of other fine institutions, focusing on completions, has turned the focus around. We're winning the battle in terms of getting higher ed more focused on completions. Witness President Powers. You've got the probably the best completion rates of any 4-year school in the state, and he has said it's not good enough. We're going to do better. We're going to raise the bar. We're going to pay more attention to our students, and because we're concerned about it, and because I, the leader of the school, am concerned about it, we're going to do it. They can do it. It's just that you got to say that there's got to be something attached to it to provide them with a little incentive. I think the proposals that were actually made were very mild in terms of the incentives and the way the legislation was styled, that it was a reachable goal.
And the legislature is listening to this. I mean, you say that you didn't get the bill, but it seems to me that there's been a lot of discussion about this. I think there's, the signal-to-noise ratio has not always been maybe as productive as possible.
Right. Right, but I mean, I think it's about drawing the public's attention to these issues, and then thereby, letting the regents know and other people in authority. I always say that legislators, I understand. I mean, I'm a recovering member of the Texas House. Okay, so I get part of the process. Their job is to be advocates for their institutions in their district. I mean, that's no secret. And then even if they don't have a UT institution, if they went to UT or they went to A&M, then obviously they're going to be concerned and advocate for the institution. That's great. I also think they need to be holding the institutions accountable for their performance. And if you look at the community colleges in terms of their completion rate or transfer rates or however you want to look at it, it's not good. I mean, they argue with me that, well, you can't measure what we do, which is BS in my opinion. And my response to them is to say, especially with the community colleges, okay, let's say I'm off by a factor of 2. In other words, you're doing twice as good as I think you are. You're still not doing very good. So let's stop worrying about exactly where we are, and let's make sure that the graph is going like this instead of going like that.
So do you think that in the end, you talked about having a meeting with the community college board members. I mean, Do you think there's a chance that you'll be able to negotiate, or not negotiate's the wrong word, but have that discussion in reasonably good faith?
Oh yeah. I mean, we had an excellent meeting. You know, they wrote me a nasty letter, sort of, you know, but it's no big deal. I mean, I'm old. I don't care anymore. You know, I wasn't put on earth to be loved, and I haven't been disappointed. So that's fine with me. You know, I mean, this is what I get paid to do. So I go in, I enjoy the policy debate, and I think that, you know, like with the community colleges, it's like, you know, getting the regents to be asking the leaders of the institutions, okay, what did you do today for increasing your completion rates? Because that's what it's all about. At the end of the day, it's about kids walking across the stage with a diploma that gets them a job and means something, so that they can be a net contributor to our economy. We're spending a lot of money, and the rate of return is not as good as it ought to be.
I want to come back to how you position in that. I want to ask you about one other policy realm that TAB's involved in, or at least has enunciated some positions, and that's immigration.
Sure.
It strikes me that TAB, like many sectors of the business community, is sort of more in the center of that debate. I mean, in terms of ideological spectrum, than a lot of at least the direction that a big faction of the Republican Party is going.
No question about it.
Talk about how you manage that.
I would even say that we're more to the left than we are to the center in terms of the political spectrum in Texas or in the U.S. for that matter.
So explain that.
Because, okay, well, I mean, you know, we have a problem. We've had a failed system since '87, I guess, when Simpson-Mazzoli passed. I mean, we went through it back then, and basically there was an amnesty back then. And the amnesty was part of a package to, you know, seal the borders and allow some migration, some immigration, and then some, like guest worker programs and that sort of thing. And it failed. It didn't work. It was never enforced. And we have some arguably 11 or 12 million undocumented people living in America today. We can't send them home. That's completely ridiculous. I mean, even the most far right, I think, you know, thinkers on this issue, I've never heard really anyone say put them on a bus. Maybe, I'm sure there's someone out there who said that, but effectively that's not a realistic response. So we have those who are here. We have a need for workers. Less so in leaner times, obviously, but in good times in Texas, there are three very important industries: agriculture, construction, and hospitality, that rely heavily on immigrant labor. And there are not enough people who are born in Texas or in America to fill those slots. There are people born in America or in Texas who fill some of the slots, but not all of the slots. So immigration is a way, legal immigration is a way to meet that need. And then finally, we feel like it's unfair for employers to be put in the position of law enforcement in terms of checking you know, credentials, et cetera, as to the legality of individuals. I mean, we all know that this is the fake ID capital of the world, right? Austin, Texas, is it not? Can I get an amen from the audience on that? I don't know, and you know, in 24 hours, how many fake IDs could we obtain, you know, if you were challenged? But we don't think it's fair for the employers to have to look and see, okay, is this real or not? You know, so therefore, we support comprehensive immigration reform at the federal level to do several things. One is to secure the borders, and then allow enough legal immigration to meet the needs of employers, and to know who people are who come across. You know, keep the bad guys out and let the people who want to work come across, and let them go back home in lean times or at Christmas or whatever, and then come back. That circularity is gone now. The second thing we need to do is to deal with those who are here by creating some sort of legal status. I mean, they're not going to self-deport. That's simply not going to happen. And then finally, we need a system of identification that the employers can completely rely upon. We don't have that today, and we need all three of those things. We also, which is sort of a comprehensive, which is, you know, stalled in Congress for 5 or 6 years now. I mean, it's just not happening. We also say that, you know, I don't know what the population here is at UT in terms of immigrants or non-nationals coming to learn and study at this fine institution. And they're given a student visa, and they come, and then when they graduate, they say, oh, by the way, now you can't stay, you have to go back home. I mean, that makes no sense whatsoever. And there have been some efforts to deal with that, and especially in the area of science, technology, engineering, and math, where we have such dire shortages. So,
how hard is it to articulate that as a business or a kind of macroeconomic position in this environment? I mean,
difficult. I mean, well, communication. If you assume that communication is a two-way street, then it's very difficult. Just saying it is not all that hard. But, you know, obviously there's a lot of frustration by Texans because the federal government has failed to act. So they beat on the door of their local legislator and say something needs to be done. Congress doesn't do anything, so they want to do something over here. And in those states that have done it, Arizona, Alabama, and Georgia, are, you know, not faring very well because they're figuring out that through the state actions that have taken place, they've actually caused people to move to other states in their labor shortages. Interestingly enough, just this week, Mississippi House passed another onerous Arizona-style legislation, and the Senate refused to pass it. So, I mean, there is a little bit of the turning of the tide, realizing that Arizona's probably not got the best solution to this problem. We believe it's a federal issue and should not be dealt with here at the state level.
Although when we go and we poll people and we ask you what are important, you know, problems facing the country and what are the important problems facing Texas, people ignore immigration at the national level and then see it as a problem facing the state.
Right.
So I want to kind of put those things together a little bit. I mean, looking at your positions on K through 12.
Right.
And part of this is asking you to kind of wear half your reformed legislator hat and half your TAB hat. We'll see, you know, how much you can do that and how fair that is. But, you know, I look at your positions on K through 12. I look at your positions on higher ed. I look at your positions on immigration, which you describe as, you know, probably left rather than even center. You know, it's hard not to notice that it seems to me the force of positions on your right in each of those areas has really grown kind of more powerful in the last few years. That is,
I agree entirely.
There's a much deeper public suspicion of, or a core of suspicion of public education really as a practice, I think, and much more intense kind of agitation about immigration. How do you manage that? And also, how do you kind of think about it, having been in the Republican Party in Texas for so long?
Right. Well, I mean, of course, I tell them they're making a big mistake, in my opinion. I mean, I think a lot of what you're seeing now is sort of Tea Party, if you will, whatever you want to call it, who are very fiscally conservative, which we are too. We're very fiscally conservative. But at the same time, I don't think that they go the next step, which is to see that these public institutions, which are so critical to us in Texas, work. I mean, I think they're about cutting the budget, but they're not about seeing that public institutions are producing a high level of productivity. I don't think they get that second part. So to me, that's very scary, whether it's transportation or water or these other issues that you mentioned. And with education, we had a very bad vote in the Texas House last year, where they voted 137, I believe it was, to 5, to gut the current accountability system. And then, quite honestly, Florence Shapiro said hell no, and it didn't pass. I mean, if it weren't for her position in the Texas Senate, I think we would be dealing with a drastically different accountability system. So I would say that these issues are tough and getting tougher.
Last question for me anyway. What do you see coming up in the next session? We kind of touched on that a little bit. You know, by everyone's account, last one was grueling, largely because of I think the fiscal position of the state and the political position on fiscal issues that was fairly locked in from the beginning. You see any movement? I mean, you see another really hard one? You see it easier?
Well, I don't know exactly where we are on money. You know, I talked to Combs the other day, and I think that obviously things are getting better financially for the state. Sales tax revenues are up, but I'm not really sure where the x-axis crosses the y-axis in terms of the overall budget. We won't really know until January of next year when she makes her estimate, or December of this year, whenever she makes it. One of the things that's really driving the budget is Medicaid. Medicaid is being dramatically expanded based on the Affordable Care Act, and so many more Texans will be eligible by law for Medicaid. And Medicaid is crowding out, education. I mean, I say that if you're a teacher, you ought to be worried about Medicaid, because those Medicaid dollars are going to come ahead of you. They have to be paid. The bills have to be paid. And as she projected that in 2023, 10 years, you're going to have 74% of the budget will be education, K-12, I believe, and Medicaid. And then so you'll have 25% will be everything else. So Medicaid is driving the budgets. Now, it is our hope that the court will throw out the bill in its entirety. That's my hope, my perhaps pipe dream, but that would relieve a lot of pressure. But the Medicaid pressure on the state's budget is just enormous and growing every day and growing exponentially because of Medicaid and because of the increase in the eligibility.
Is an approach that says, you know, absolutely no new revenue sustainable in that?
I don't know. We'll just have to look at it. I mean, we're looking at some, we haven't reached conclusions, but we're looking at transportation and water and trying to come up with some solutions for funding for those issues. My goal and our leadership's goal is to try to be affirmative in responses rather than just saying no, as you stated, and try to get some money for those other things through other, you know, non-tax means if possible, or something that you can call not a tax, user fees, whatever, because those issues need to be addressed as well. I think generally there's not going to be, you're not going to see a tax bill next session. I mean, the only thing, actually, I guess the only thing to create a tax bill or a major change in the tax structure would be a ruling from the Supremes on school finance. Right. I mean, if they laid out something, you know, that required it. Sort of like which was the genesis of the last change in the business tax.
Right. All right. Well, thank you. I want to
Sure.
open it up for questions. And, okay, let's start in the back and then go over here.
Now, the legislature seems unable to link the will of the electorate in any way to the property tax issue. So can you comment on the property tax issue, and would you reference back to the structured deficit that we started out with, that there was a lawsuit before this lawsuit of the districts?
What is the will of the people with regard to property tax?
No, I mean, do we want higher property taxes, and is that how we're
No.
going to help schools, or do we want lower property taxes? But if you're going to have lower property taxes, how are the schools going to improve their performance? Right. And if you've already cut, you know, $4 billion from the budget, and you think that's a reasonable outcome, well, how are you going to get all these improvements in productivity?
Well, I mean, I don't think that there's necessarily a direct relationship in terms of funding. I mean, if you look at in terms of outcomes or performance, if you look at 10 years of funding prior to this most recent session, and you add in inflation, student growth, and growth in the population of students who are economically disadvantaged, which is the commonality of, you know, difficult to educate kids, the funding for the schools actually increased beyond all of those things by, I believe, some $5 billion over 10 years. So there's been a lot of money put into education, obviously not in the last session. With regards to property taxes, I mean, everyone can agree property taxes are too high in Texas, but we do not have an income tax, and we're not going to have one for the foreseeable future. So there's going to be a heavy reliance on the property tax to fund schools and other services at the, you know, the county and city level for the foreseeable future. I mean, nobody believes it, but property taxes were reduced substantially. Nobody really believes it because the values of the property went up, and therefore the tax bill went up, but the rate was dropped dramatically. And if the rate hadn't been dropped, you know, with the increase in the values, the property taxes would have expanded even more so for some of that money, albeit not enough to pay for that through the new franchise tax.
Is there any universe where you could imagine an income tax in Texas?
Not any time in the near future. I don't know. I mean, I think that, you know, of course, I think the big change will come probably, you know, when Hispanics begin to vote, which they generally don't now at this point in terms of their population. And depending on who wins the battle for the hearts and the souls of Hispanics. I mean, you have a lot of traditional conservatives really in the Hispanic community. But people think of activists, et cetera, as being, you know, more democratic, and certainly that's been the tradition. I would say that the Republican Party is doing everything it can to push away the Hispanic vote. So perhaps some combination of the sheer numbers of Hispanics and maybe an increased vote could at some point bring an income tax, but I'm not sure how long that would take. Perhaps you know better than I.
Well, take a while would be my suspicion. Yeah. It's a big topic. Next.
I mean, you can't pass, the reality is you are not going to pass a tax bill next session. So get over it and move on.
Right. That's why I said any possible universe. Yeah.
Right.
I know you said Medicaid and education will take up 74% of the budget. Do you feel like the prison system, it has a $6 billion budget, and even though it's been trimmed by 10% in the last legislature session, do you feel like with the lockup culture that we have, that an increase in the prison system finance will hurt the public education system?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that I am really a 30 or 40,000 foot guy on prisons, okay? I want to say that up front. We send too many people to prison. I don't think there's any question about that. It's expensive as hell. 40 grand a year, whatever it is, to house these guys. And I think that a lot of it is driven by the local communities. I mean, the judges, are elected, and all they care about is getting them from their county to another county. That's what they're concerned about. And, well, obviously there's been some more criticism late of prosecutors, but in general, lock them up has been the attitude. And it's not cost effective. I mean, it would be far superior. And we supported some legislation last time to increase probation and keep them back home and keep them working. Why did we send them to Huntsville and give them a PhD in crime? At the tune of $40,000 per year. I think there are a lot of things that we could do more effectively in that area and more efficiently.
Do you think drug reform is part of that? Drug policy reform is part of that?
Well, I'm not an advocate for drug reform. I don't really, again, I don't know enough about the subject. I'm against legalization. I would make that very clear. Lessening penalties, perhaps, I don't really know.
Yeah, fair enough. Over here.
I got a two-part question. One, do your children or child, did they go to public school?
Yes, sir, they did.
Okay. Now, a 1% corporate tax would have solved the budget shortfall for education in this state, and I hear it would have solved the budget crisis, it would have paid for education in the surrounding states as well. But all I hear TAB and TPPF say, if we tax businesses, that's going to kill jobs. I don't buy that argument, especially when companies in Texas, like ExxonMobil, they're making record-breaking profits every year. The sales tax that you were referring to, or that we generated more revenue from that, those sales tax, that's a regressive tax. It's put on the backs of low and moderate income families. Why aren't businesses that are so wealthy in the state, why aren't they paying their fair share?
Well, they are paying their fair share. I would disagree with you. If you take overall all taxes paid in Texas, 62% of them are paid by business. There's a misnomer about sales tax. 56% of sales tax is paid by business because a lot of what businesses buy are taxable. Now, I own a little bitty manufacturing firm, so I understand if I bought raw materials and put it in the manufacturing process, sales tax would only be charged once, and I wouldn't pay sales tax, I would collect sales tax. But businesses pay a lot of sales tax. With regard to any kind of a business income tax, which we have at one level, we have a gross margins tax, which some argue it is an income tax by a different name. We already have one. Excuse me?
It's not bringing in the projected revenue that it thought it would.
Well, yeah. I think in good times it probably would be close. In bad times, it's not going to produce as much money. There's just no way.
Do you think that's going to get revisited? We made oblique reference to that.
I don't think, my theory about the franchise tax is, no one loves the franchise tax, okay? I don't think there's anyone out there who's like, okay, please, please. At the same time, I think that a lot of different people have a lot of different ideas about what ought to be done. And there is, as best I can understand it, not much consensus on what should be done. So lacking a consensus on what should be done, I think the most probable outcome is nothing in terms of the legislative process. That's my theory, which will probably be proven wrong next spring.
The speaker sent some indirect signals that it ought to be studied over the interim, but I haven't heard much about how those studies have progressed.
I don't think they've started. I mean, people, I'm sure, well, Ways and Means has met some, and I'm sure people have testified as to some of their legitimate concerns and the unfair treatment of certain industries. And but I think any kind of massive overhaul would not happen, especially next session, if for no other reason, once again, because of school finance. You know, if you've got some options open to you for increased revenue in response to what might come from the Supreme Court, then you'd probably want to hold on to them until you know what the hell they say. Don't you have to be a student here to ask questions?
He has honorary student status.
Okay.
This has nothing to do with education. It's more of a legislative process question. We're going to have about 30 to 35 new House members and I think 4 new senators. How is the loss of institutional knowledge going to affect the dynamics of the next legislative session?
Right. Well, you know, I don't know. That's a good question. I think I'm not sure that it. I don't know how much impact it'll have on the process because, you know, basically the leadership. Well, leadership in the Senate obviously is probably going to change. I think it is. We don't know for certain. Obviously, the governor's going to remain the same. Speaker Strauss is going to be reelected. So, to a large extent, let's see. I'm trying to answer your question honestly. I mean, you're going to have a new Senate Finance Chairman, obviously, but it's not going to be a rookie. It's going to be a seasoned senator, whoever that person is. And in the House, you're probably going to have, assuming Pitts gets reelected, he would be Appropriations Chairman again, I would think. So, I'm not sure, you know, how much actual change there would be based on the new members. I don't see any big ideological shift. I mean, I think the Republicans will lose some seats, you know, maybe in the range of, you know, 5 or 6, 7, 8 seats perhaps, but that's not going to change the outcome very much, in my opinion.
Underline that it's really the leadership leadership is most important in terms of
management,
the thing being able to.
Right.
How do you think that? How do you think management has been in the chambers?
I think that's a good question. I mean, I think that you know, I guess I would say in general, I think there could be some more leadership on the part of management. I think there's some good reasons why maybe there wasn't. I mean, I think Joe Strauss is a very good speaker and did exactly what he was elected to do. Because you had a transition from, you know, a strong leader, a strong speaker, to which created some friction, obviously, whatever, and led to the change in the speakership. And I think Joe was hired by the membership to, you know, the cliche is make the trains run on time, and you know, be more in the role of a referee. And I think he's done an excellent job in that regard. I think some of the things that you've said earlier indicate that he may be beginning to see his role somewhat differently this coming session.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's been a hard job.
Right. Oh, hell. 150 egos all complaining and whining about their office space or their parking space, or my God.
Yeah. Well, that's always
you know,
hard. Yeah.
Right.
But
you bet. It's a tough job. And you know, it's hard to create a coalition around issues. I mean, these are difficult issues that they grapple with.
And the House is more polarized than when you were there.
Right.
I mean, there's no.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Well, when I mean, I don't know what the high point, we probably had maybe 50 Republicans when I left, something like that. So I do think that still, though, in the House, I think any member really has an opportunity to influence the process by developing expertise and respect of other members through becoming knowledgeable about particular issues that don't necessarily, it's nothing like Congress.
Right.
I mean, it's much far superior to Congress in that regard. And I think that still is true. Obviously, we have, you know, both Republican and Democratic chairmen. And I think the Democratic members have, you know, still have, as members of minority, obviously have a very good opportunity to participate and engage. I think sometimes they lose that. I don't know, but, you know. Right. I mean, there's certain givens that are, you know, there's certain things like tax bill. I mean, you can rail for a tax bill, but it's not going to happen. So, in my opinion, what you want to do is focus on how the money is spent, you know, and you can have some impact there. Right. Because I got to write a budget.
Sure. If I see no more hands, I'm going to thank Bill Hammond for coming today.
Okay, thank you.
It's fun for us. It was fun for you.
Great. Yeah.